We were married for 25 years, a quarter of a century. When I think back to the beginning, it feels like a dream threaded with both golden light and shadow. We were young, ambitious, and hopeful. Life didn't give us everything, but we worked hard, and we had love. At least I believed we did. My parents were the backbone of our early years. They were always there, quiet, steady support that never faltered. When we were struggling with money, they offered us a plot of land they had saved for retirement. They said, "Build your future here," and we did. Together, we laid the first bricks of our house, quite literally. My father helped every weekend with the construction, and my mother brought us meals, wiping the sweat from our brows like we were still children in their care. When we had our first child and then our second, my parents stepped in like seasoned angels, babysitting, helping with school drop-offs, watching over the kids when we just needed a moment of quiet. My parents never asked for anything in return. They gave because that's what love meant to them. I remember once, when my husband was laid off, it was my father who said, "Don't worry, we've got you," and they did. They covered our mortgage for 3 months, refusing to take anything back. Family takes care of family, my mother always said, and for so long, I believed. We were all living that truth together. My husband seemed grateful, loyal. He called my parents mom and dad, joked with them, toasted them at holidays. He said, "We couldn't have made it without you," but things change. Or maybe people change, or maybe they were never who you thought they were. The beginning of the end came slowly, like water seeping into wood, quiet, subtle, and rotting everything from the inside. It started with the way he spoke about my mother after her diagnosis. She had always been kind to him, generous, but when she needed more care, real care, nursing home care, he flinched, he grimaced at costs, he complained about stress. He stopped calling her mom, and then one day he said something I would never forget. Something that cracked the foundation of us, and I realized love doesn't always last. Sometimes it erodes in silence until all that's left is dust and memories. The decision to place my mother in a nursing home was not made lightly. I spent months agonizing over it, looking at in-home care options, rearranging schedules, hoping for a solution that didn't feel like surrender. But my mother, proud even in her illness, insisted, "I don't want to be a burden to you or the children," she said. "You already do enough." We found a small, reputable facility not far from our home. Clean, quiet, staffed with kind faces and warm hearts. It wasn't perfect, but it was safe. I visited her nearly every day. My husband came only when I asked him to, and even then, his visits were short, distracted. He never spoke much to her anymore, and she noticed. "Is he all right?" she once asked me, her voice thin with fatigue. "He seems distant." At first, I made excuses. "He's stressed from work. He's tired. He doesn't know how to handle sickness." But the truth was harder to swallow. He simply didn't care to try. One afternoon, about a year into my mother's stay at the home, we sat in our kitchen. Bills were on the table: electricity, groceries, the children's school fees, and then the nursing home invoice. "I think we should start paying for your mother from your account," he said, not looking up from his phone. I stared at him. "What do you mean?" "We've always shared expenses," he shrugged. "She's your mother. It's too much for us." "Too much for us," he said just days after asking if we could start looking at cars. A new model he had his eye on cost €90,000. He had no problem spending that. No hesitation there. But when it came to the woman who helped raise our children, who gave us land for our home, who fed him every Sunday, suddenly the money was a problem. That night, I opened a separate account. I started paying the bills for my mother from my own savings, out of pride, out of love, out of a growing sense that I could no longer count on him to carry the weight of compassion. And with every quiet withdrawal, I felt something else being taken too: trust, respect, the sense that we were still on the same team. What I didn't know was that this was just the beginning. It was early spring when my father's health started to decline. At first, it was subtle. He forgot dates, mixed up names. Then came the weakness in his hands, the weight loss, the stumbling when he walked. The doctor's words hit hard: degenerative neurological disease. The prognosis was uncertain, but the trajectory was clear. I didn't cry. Not then. I was already carrying the weight of my mother's absence, the strain in my marriage, and the exhaustion of pretending that things at home were still good. But this news, this quiet devastation, hollowed me. When I told my husband, he barely looked up from the television. "That's terrible," he muttered, more out of obligation than empathy. I waited, hoping for a moment of warmth, a gesture, anything. But then he added, with a strange tightness in his voice, "I hope it doesn't drag on too long." I blinked. "What do you mean?" He didn't flinch. "You know, for him, for everyone. And frankly, they've got money. If he's gone, it's just easier. All that inheritance talk, remember?" I stared at him like I didn't know the man I had lived with for 25 years. Because in that moment, I truly didn't. I spent the next Weeks in a fog of care schedules and phone calls, my father had always been strong, full of quiet wisdom and patience. Watching him diminish was like watching the earth itself crumble. He never complained, not once. He still smiled when I arrived. He still asked about the children. And he still remarkably asked after my husband. Even though the man hadn't visited him in over a month, I began to see things with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself before. I saw how my husband flinched when the phone rang in case it was more bad news. I saw how his warmth had grown cold over the years, not from exhaustion, but from choice. It wasn't the sickness that ruined us. It was the way he reacted to it. He resented the burden. Even though that burden was my family, people who had given us everything. So I started making plans. Not out of anger, not even out of revenge, but out of necessity. If he couldn't carry the weight of love, he wouldn't carry the rewards of it either. I stopped talking as much, not out loud, not to him. There was nothing left to say, really. Conversations became transactional. What time the kids needed picking up, if there was milk in the fridge, which bills were due. He didn't notice the silence, or maybe he preferred it. But in the quiet, I was building something, a plan. I remembered something my mother told me when I was young. When a friend had betrayed me at school, when people show you what they value, believe them, and never beg someone to love what they're incapable of cherishing. That line echoed in my mind every time he rolled his eyes at the mention of my parents. Every time he tapped through car listings while I searched for medical equipment. Every time he referred to their legacy as their money and not the foundation of our life. I began gathering documents, deeds, bank statements, wills. I met with a lawyer, quietly, carefully. I ensured that the house my parents had given us, and every asset tied to their generosity, would not follow him if he left, or rather, when everything we had was built on their sacrifices. But he had walked over their kindness like it was a welcome mat. That's not how it would end. I started shifting money, not stealing, just reclaiming the funds my parents had given us, the down payments, the early loans, the support during hard times. Those belonged to me now, not because I was greedy, but because I was protecting what was sacred. He, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware, or uncaring. He had his eyes on a luxury car, a symbol, I suppose, of a life he thought he deserved. He spoke about it often, as though he'd already earned it. You've worked hard, I told him once, and he smiled. But he didn't notice the tone in my voice, or the resignation in my eyes. He didn't know I had already packed away the memories, the wedding photos, the love letters, the anniversary cards. I'd hidden them in a box in the attic, not out of bitterness, but because they didn't belong to this version of us. They belonged to someone I used to believe in. Soon, I would ask him to leave, and he would go with exactly what he brought, a suitcase and a smile that, even then, would probably be wondering where it all went wrong. It sat in the corner of our closet, half buried under winter coats and old shoeboxes, the same battered suitcase he'd brought with him all those years ago when we moved into the house my parents helped us build. I remembered the day he arrived. With it, he had nothing but charm, ambition, and a dream. I had the land, the backing of my parents, and a heart wide open. He used to joke that he came with nothing but love. At the time, I believed it was enough. Now, I stared at that suitcase and saw it for what it truly was, a symbol of how much I had given, and how little he had ever intended to carry. I pulled it out slowly. It still smelled faintly of old leather and stale cologne. The zipper was rusty but functional. I set it upright near the bedroom door in plain sight. I didn't say a word about it. I didn't need to. Its presence was a silent declaration. That night, he came home late again. I was sitting at the kitchen table. Papers neatly arranged, copies of the house deed now solely in my name, account closures, and a legal notice finalizing the separation of assets. He raised an eyebrow at the sight. What's all this? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply said, you'll be leaving tomorrow. He laughed. That smug half-chuckle he reserved for things he thought were jokes. Leaving? Are you serious? I nodded. You'll take what you brought, nothing more. He stepped back, the smirk fading. You can't do that. I can, I said, and I have. He looked down at the papers. Realization dawned slowly. Then all at once, his name wasn't on the house anymore. The accounts had been separated. The inheritance he quietly drooled over had been legally redirected to my children. His voice turned bitter. You planned this? Yes, I replied. Steady, because while I was watching my parents fade, you were watching your own bank balance. He said many things that night, accusations, threats, half-hearted apologies. I let him say them. I owed him nothing anymore, not even my anger. The next morning, I woke early and made coffee. He came down the stairs, suitcase in hand. For the first time in years, we looked at each other honestly. He had arrived with nothing but a suitcase, and now he was leaving with it too. The house was still after he left, not quiet still. There's a difference. Quiet can be peaceful. Stillness is something else. It's the heavy silence that follows a storm. When debris lies scattered and the sky forgets how to breathe, I watched through the window as he walked down the driveway with the suitcase. No parting words, no plea to stay, just a man, finally unmasked, walking away from a life he never truly honored. I didn't cry. I thought I might. 25 years deserve something, right? But there was nothing left in me to grieve for. The marriage had ended long before that final step out the door. What I felt now was exhaustion. Yes, but underneath it, a soft, unfamiliar current of relief. The children noticed quickly. They weren't young anymore. I didn't lie to them, but I spared them the ugliest truths. We've decided to live apart, I told them. My daughter's eyes narrowed. My son stayed quiet, then asked gently, is that what you want? No, but it's what I need. I wanted to say, instead. I just nodded. In the following days, I reclaimed the house. Not just legally, emotionally. I moved the furniture, I painted the hallway, I replaced the couch he insisted on keeping even though it hurt my back. I hung new curtains, I opened the windows. And one by one, I brought life back into the rooms that had felt like mausoleums of a dying love. I visited my mother more often. She had good days and bad, but when I told her he'd left, she didn't seem surprised. She reached for my hand, squeezed it weakly, and whispered, "You held on longer than you should have." When I told my father, now nearly immobile, he just looked at me with those worn, knowing eyes and nodded. That was all, and it was enough. In that moment, I realized they both had seen it long before I had. They had hoped I would choose myself before the damage became irreversible. Grief doesn't always come when you think it will. Sometimes it waits for a moment of stillness and creeps in when you least expect it, but so does strength. And as I stood in my kitchen, alone but whole, I realized I had finally come home. The first weekend alone was strange, not bad, just unfamiliar. Like moving into a new house where all the furniture is the same but the air feels different. Cleaner, quieter. I woke up without the sound of his alarm, no sighs from the bathroom, no smell of his aftershave. The quiet was deep, but not sad. It was the kind of quiet you get when something has been lifted off your chest and, for the first time in years, you can breathe all the way in. I made coffee and drank it slowly, the way I used to before life got so heavy. I stood by the kitchen window and watched the light fall on the floor tiles. Everything seemed sharper now, colors, smells, even time. I noticed how the ivy had crept up the fence again. I made a mental note to trim it, no more waiting for someone else to care. That Sunday, I went to see my father. He could no longer speak, but his eyes were bright. I brought him his favorite tea and sat beside him, telling him about the little things, the children's schoolwork, the new curtains, the coffee shop that opened around the corner. He blinked and tilted his head when I mentioned his granddaughter had started painting again. I think she's like you, I said, quiet but full of stories. He smiled, then soft and crooked, and for a moment I felt like a daughter again. Not just someone holding up the walls of a crumbling world. Later that afternoon, I visited my mother. She was asleep when I arrived, her hands folded neatly like she was praying in a dream. I sat beside her and just watched. Her breathing was slow but steady. She looked peaceful. I realized then that this chapter of life wasn't about loneliness. It was about realignment, about placing the right people back in the center of my heart. The ones who had always been there, my parents, my children, myself, for so long. I thought marriage meant endurance. I believed that staying, no matter how painful, was a badge of honor, but I was wrong. Freedom isn't running away. It's returning to yourself, and I was finally there. A few weeks after he left, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table again, same spot, same time of day. The sun was pouring in through the window, warming the back of my neck. I had a pen in one hand and a blank sheet of paper in the other. I hadn't planned to write anything, but something about the silence in the house that day, the kind that settles in when healing begins, stirred the words up inside me. It started like this: you won't read this, and that's all right. I'm not writing it for you. It felt good to say that. I told him everything I hadn't said the night he left. About how I used to believe in the kind of love that survives anything. About how hard I tried to keep that belief alive, even when he started turning his back on the very people who held us up. I told him how small his words had made me feel in the last few years. Not loud words, he wasn't a shouter, but the quiet ones, the dismissals, the silences, the little sighs every time I brought up my parents or asked for help or dared to cry. I told him about the look in my father's eyes when I finally told him it was over. About my mother's fragile fingers gripping mine when I told her I had taken back what was mine. How proud they both seemed, not because I had left a man, but because I had found myself again. I told him he never broke me, not really. He just taught me where my limits were, and in a way, I thanked him for that. I ended the letter simply: you entered my life with a suitcase, and you left with it. But I've kept what matters: my dignity, my children's respect, and the love of the people who always deserved mine. Then I folded the paper, put it in an envelope, and tucked it into the back of a drawer. I never planned to send it. Some things are written only so you don't have to carry them anymore. The next day, I cleared out the rest of his things, not in anger, in peace. And for the first time in years, I felt light. It's strange how life reshapes itself after the storm passes. You expect wreckage. You prepare for loneliness, but instead, you find room to breathe, room to think, room to be. I spent the next few weeks relearning who I was without him, not the woman who bent herself into quiet compromise, not the one who calculated the emotional temperature of the house before speaking, but the one who existed before all of that, who read before bed, who laughed loudly in the kitchen, who danced while cleaning the living room. I started doing things I'd set aside for when things calmed down. I joined a book club, I visited old friends, I began taking long walks alone, listening to music that had nothing to do with his taste. I even began writing again, nothing grand, just little stories, memories, moments I'd stored away while life was too noisy to let them out. The children watched me with cautious curiosity. I could see it in their eyes, that delicate balance between worry and wonder. My daughter started calling more often, my son lingered longer in conversation. They asked questions about my past, about how I met their grandparents, about what I dreamed of when I was young. And for the first time, I told them. I told them how I'd wanted to travel when I was their age, how I used to write poems on scraps of receipts and napkins, how I loved my parents not just for what they gave us, but for who they were: gentle, patient, proud people who believed in doing good even when it wasn't easy. They asked about him, too. Eventually, I didn't lie, but I didn't poison their memories either. He loved you, I said honestly, just not the way I needed to be loved. Some nights, when the house was quiet again, I found myself holding their childhood drawings, old birthday cards, photos of the early years before the rot set in. Not to mourn the marriage, but to honor what was real in it: my love, my effort, my belief. And slowly, I began to understand something I never did before. Love isn't what you give up for someone. It's what you become when you stop giving yourself away. Summer came gently that year. The trees bloomed early, as if nature itself was eager for a fresh start. My house now felt different with the windows open, letting in sunlight and warm breeze and possibility. One Saturday afternoon, I found myself standing in the garden, watching the wind move through the tall grass my father had planted years ago. He used to say it reminded him of the fields from his childhood, the ones he worked in barefoot before he knew what a pension or a mortgage was. He was gone now. Peacefully, quietly, my mother followed a few months later. I held her hand when she left, just like she held mine when I came into the world. There was no drama, no fear, only the soft fading of a woman who had loved fiercely and given more than she ever asked for in return. I buried them side by side beneath the willow tree on the family plot. We planted lavender around the grave. My daughter visits it often. Sometimes she brings a sketchbook. I don't ask her what she draws. I don't need to. I know it's them. Their absence is real, heavy some days, but so is their presence in the way the house stands strong, in the way I hold myself upright now, in the lessons I carry every day. My ex-husband reached out once, not long ago. Just an email, short, flat. He said he missed the kids, asked if I'd be open to a call. I replied politely but firmly. I let the children decide for themselves, because they're old enough now to choose who deserves their time. I don't carry bitterness anymore, just clarity. And that's enough. Some evenings, I sit on the back porch with a glass of wine, the sun dipping low behind the trees, and I think about the suitcase, the one he brought with him, the one he left with. I realize now that I carried far more years of patience, loyalty, care, and endurance. I was the weight that kept everything balanced. And when I let go, the truth of our lives scattered like dust. But in that scattering, something beautiful happened. I found myself again, not the wife, not the daughter, not the mother. Just me. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like more than enough.